It's my joy to welcome each of you back to our session in the study of church revitalization. When we were together last time, we talked about the three different models, the overarching models of church revitalization, acquisitional, covenantal, and then the last one that we spent a good deal of time on was what type of revitalization? Do you remember? Organic revitalization, which simply means you're using the people that you have, the leadership that you have in the church, and hoping and praying and strategizing that the two big principles involved in revitalization would be shaped. Number one, leadership, and number two, behaviors. And I personally believe that organic revitalization works. I've seen it work. There are many examples of it working in our area and across America if those two primary factors are addressed in the effort. If leadership truly steps up and becomes revitalization leadership, and then if the church is moved by the Spirit of God to the point that their hearts are open to real change in the church so that the behaviors become what they ought to be. So for the next few sessions, we're going to unfold that organic revitalization model a little further. And just to point out to you, for this session, you have several sheets. And those of you that are watching online, let me encourage you to pull up those PDFs, maybe even print them out so that you have those in front of you for the session. You might want to make some notes as we go through these things, but you'll be referring to these as I lead you, because all of this that we'll talk about today is not in the PowerPoint or the notes that come from the PowerPoint. So if you recall, as we looked at an organic model of revitalization, we said there's three really big questions that have to be addressed if you move into that type of revitalization in your church. Those big questions are, number one, where are we? Number two, where are we going? Number three, how are we going to get there? That's real rocket science, right? That's tough stuff. As I've told you before, revitalization theoretically is not difficult, but as you lead a place and a people to change, it can be wrought with a lot of difficulties. But in theory, there's just a few things that you need to think through and you need to do. Also, it bears repeating at this point as we're looking at some technical things and using some tools that hopefully through the Spirit's leadership men have developed, but they are man-made tools. So as we look at these tools and we look at strategies, never ever forget the spiritual dynamic of revitalization. I can't emphasize that enough, because you won't have revitalization without revival, and you don't have revival without repentance, and repentance is all about what? Change. So remember that. Don't lose that as we deal with, again, a lot of the man-made tools that we can employ in a revitalization strategy. So what we're going to do in this session, again, is really unfold that first big question, where are we, which speaks to the current reality of the church. There are a lot of tools that are at your fingertips and at your disposal that you can tap into to help you clearly understand where the church is. And let me say that if you're a leader in the church, whether or not you're going to employ some grand revitalization strategy, as you think through your leadership steps, man, you need to know the stuff we'll talk about today. You need to know where the church is in all the different facets that you can explore it. So very quickly, let me remind you of some of the things that you can use. This is not an exhaustive list. You can add to this a good bit. In fact, I'll add one more at the end that I don't have listed on the PowerPoint or on the notes. But again, there are a lot of different things you can use, but these are very helpful tools when you think about revitalization. First is church-wide assessment. Second is looking at community demographics. Third is going through the church records or pulling out the church profiles, the ACPs, so that you can perform a vital statistics analysis. Number 4, looking through your building and grounds. Number 5, using a secret shopper, a secret guest. Number 6, having an exercise that really completes an inventory of historical events. Now, one that you might want to make note of that I did not include on the PowerPoint or in the notes is focus groups. Focus groups in some situations can really help you understand why things are the way they are in your congregation. What is a focus group? Has anybody ever participated in a focus group? Yes, you have?
Well, mine was a county assessment.
Yeah.
In another state, but
okay.
We focused on what the needs of the county were.
Right.
And what we needed to do to
sure.
Get those needs worked out.
Yeah. A focus group in a lot of situations can replace doing church-wide assessment. And in my mind, I think of really age groups, age demographics in the church. And you can pull, we talked about last time how you pull together a church vision team that represents a cross section of the whole church, kind of a microcosm of the congregation. If you do focus groups, what you do is you select 3 to 5 people that represent a microcosm of each generation in the church. And you can get them together in a room and ask some very pointed questions and record their replies. And you can learn a lot about current reality. If any of you are interested in questions that you ask focus groups, that kind of thing, let me know. I'll be glad to share with you what I have. It's very contextual, when you use focus groups, because you're asking very specific things about that particular congregation. So if you have any questions and want to know more about focus groups, I'd be glad to help you with that one-on-one.
They were time consuming too.
They are very time consuming. Mm-hmm. They really are, because you've got to find time to sit down with the group. And by the way, let me mention this as well. Not only are they time consuming, but you just about have to have a third party to conduct them. Because people want to talk about things that maybe they wouldn't be comfortable talking about if someone subjective was in the room with them. So enough about focus groups. Again, if you want to think about that a little more, if you want to talk about it for your situation, I'd be glad to help you. So let's begin to look at church-wide assessment. When you see the word assessment, what do you think about?
Finding out what it needs.
By finding out the needs?
Well, I think about my day job.
Think about a day job?
Yeah. That is my job, to assess.
To assess property values, yes. What else you think about? When I think about the word assessment, I think of the dreaded word test.
Yeah.
Isn't a test in school an assessment? Yeah, that's what it is. I had a clever professor in undergrad one time that I think I had him in psychology, which is a quirky class to begin with for those of you that have studied psychology at a college level. But anyway, he liked to use the word opportunity. Instead of test or exam or assessment. He said, look at these as opportunities to share what you've studied and what you've come to know. So assessment, that's what I think about. I think about a test, an examination that is going to take a person or a group of people and ask some very probing things, and you come out of that hopefully with an overarching view of the health of an organization. Here's what assessment does. Now, before I move into this bullet, let me say this. Assessment does not fix anything. I think I mentioned that the last time when I briefly talked about assessments. An assessment will not fix anything. In fact, if you don't plan to do something with it, don't conduct an assessment. Does everybody hear me?
It's a waste of time.
Yeah, if you're not going to do anything with it, don't conduct an assessment. I think about it like going to the doctor. The doctor performs examinations so he can study you. The doctor's a scientist, right? And you are his subject, and he is studying you, and he performs the tests so that he can evaluate you, and then he can do what? He can prescribe a course of activity, whether it's taking medicines, whether it's going on a diet. I didn't have to mention that, did I? More exercise, on and on the list goes. Well, there's two things about that. If a doctor did his tests on you and then never told you anything, you're going to be upset about that. And you're going to say, doctor, you drew my blood, you probed me, you did this and you did that. Tell me something. I want some results, right? And then if he gave you bad results and then didn't prescribe for you medications or activities to remedy those bad results, what are you going to think? You're going to think, I've wasted my money, and you're going to be upset, and you're going to find what? Probably a new doctor, right? So, assessment, never, ever, ever do assessment if you don't plan to do something with it. It's like I said about change and vision. If you start probing a church and wanting them to change and prescribing change without vision, they get frustrated about that. If you do assessment and you don't tell them what to do with the findings, again, that's going to be very, very frustrating to the people. So assessment is, you've got to be very careful with it, but it can be a very important tool, because here's what it does. It moves the conversation from being subjective to being objective. What do I mean by that? What does that mean to you? To move something from being subjective to objective.
More than just an opinion.
That's right. You're the leader. You get into the mix and you begin to lead and begin to try to shape that group of people. You become very subjective. You've got opinions, and most leaders are going to let their opinions be known, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes people don't want to hear those opinions if they're not backed up with some facts. So something that's subjective has been in the room, gathered some information, and has developed an opinion that may not be 100% correct. Objective is different from being subjective, because you gather the information, you analyze the information, and then the information, as it's analyzed, brings out a report. So you move from subjective to objective in nature. It moves the conversation from being anecdotal to factual. What I mean by anecdotal, again, that's observation. You're in the room, you hear things, you see things, you formulate an opinion. Factual is when you actually do the hard work of extrapolating the information and putting it together in a way that makes sense. It does this. It moves the conversation from being one where the pastor or the leader or the consultant is wagging his finger at the congregation and saying, you all do this, but you don't do this, and on it goes. It moves it from that to being, here's your report, and this is what you're saying about yourself. It's not what I think about you, but it's what you're saying about you. It's like getting the report card. I'm sure you heard the little story about the boy that brought home a report card that was just full of D's and F's, and Mama jumped all over him. So I can't believe that you're goofing off at school like that. You brought home this report card, nothing but bad grades on it. And he stopped her and he said, but Mama, since you were a little girl, everything has changed. And she said, oh, really? And he said, oh, yeah, because now in school, F's for fine, D's for dandy, C's for could do better, B's for bad, and A's for awful. So, you know, you can change the way you describe things, but at the end of the day, we know what the A means, and we know what the F means, and it becomes for you a report card that's sharing actual findings from the congregation. When you do any kind of assessment, this is critically important. You need to choose a tool that gauges not just perception, but more importantly, behavior. You want a tool that gauges behavior. I can tell you this, we all believe good things about ourselves, you know? For instance, and I'll show you this, demonstrate it a little more in a moment, but if you ask the average member of an average Southern Baptist church, do you believe in evangelism? Or you can even go so far as to ask him or her, is your church an evangelistic church? Well, here's what that person's going to do. They're going to take that question, is my church an evangelistic church? And they're going to begin to answer it like this. Well, my pastor does present the gospel and he gives public invitations. So we're an evangelistic church. We support missions. We give special offerings. So we want to see the world come to Christ. So we're a mission-minded evangelistic church. And so the average person from the average Baptist church, if you ask him or her, is your church an evangelistic church? They're probably going to say yes. And you know what? Really, they're not completely wrong about that, because we do talk a lot about evangelism. We do sing, Send the Light, the blessed gospel light. We do sing, Wafted on the rolling tide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. And so there is that value of evangelism in most Baptist churches, and I would go so far as to say in most evangelical churches. So when you ask a question that doesn't get underneath that layer and probe down to behaviors, individual behaviors, you're not getting an accurate reflection. Does that make sense? So perception sometimes can be good, in that if you ask a perception question and follow that up with a behavior question, sometimes that's a handy tool, because you can say, folks, this is what you're saying you believe, but here's what you're doing. Here's your value, but here's your practice. So if it does both, that can be healthy, but the bottom line in any assessment has to be behavior. If you really want to know the health of the church, you must probe behavior. So I say to you, the best indicator of church health is not perception, but it's behavior. We could come up with all kinds of illustrations on that, but I would just take you back to the doctor's office. You know, you go in and step on the scale, that's pretty objective, isn't it? And it's going to reflect some of your behaviors. You can think you weigh, you can fill in the blank. I won't put anybody on the spot here, but yeah, that's right. You can think you weigh this, but when you step on the scale, it's indicative of your behavior. So I hope you get that. It's not about perception, but it's about behavior. Let me give you, and then I will show you one specifically in just a moment, but let me give you 3 tools, and there are all kinds. I could give you a list of 100 of these, but these are the 3 that I'm most familiar with, that I've worked with a great deal. The Lawless Group, just to help you understand who that is, years ago, when Tom Rayner left Southern Seminary to become president of Lifeway, his assistant, Chuck Lawless, dear friend of mine, became the dean of the Billy Graham School, and Rayner had to give up his church consulting practice to be the president of Lifeway, and so Lawless took on all the old Rayner stuff years ago. Of course, now it's kind of flip-flopping a little bit, where Dr. Rayner has retired from Lifeway. He's actually going back into doing primarily revitalization consulting. But nonetheless, Rayner first developed a really good tool that dealt with perception and behavior. Lawless and the Lawless Group has it now, and you can go home, or if you want to see an example of it, I'd be glad again to provide that to you. But it's a good tool. It's lengthy. It's 4 pages and 160 questions, and there is a fee associated with it. It will cost a church a startup fee of $275, and that's only for so many, I think up to 50 perhaps, surveys, and every 10 surveys you add to that, it's another $25 or something like that. But it's a good one. It's a really good tool. Several years ago now, those of you that kind of follow church health and publications associated with church health, you know that Lifeway did the Transformational Church Project. Out of that project, they developed the Transformational Church Assessment Tool. We call it the TCAT, which is web-based. In other words, if you use it in your church, people have to get online to do the survey, or you can print it out, they can mark up a paper, and someone acting on that person's behalf gets online and enters the data. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it can be done on paper, but somebody has to do the work of doing it online. It's 10 pages. If you print it out, it's 10 pages long. It's about 80 questions, and the startup cost to it is $200. Now, I put the prices on there not to make you think that any of these are prohibitive, because any church that wants to get serious about studying itself, what's $275 or $200? I mean, that's no big deal. But several years ago now, at Kentucky Baptist Convention, some of my colleagues and I developed what we call the Behavior Assessment Tool. Now, the beautiful thing about the Behavior Assessment Tool is that it is 2 pages. It runs off front and back. So what we did was we took an old tool that we had. Some of you that's been in Kentucky Baptist life for a while, you may remember a tool we had out that was called the Ministry Toolbox. Some of you may remember that. You could buy it from the convention, and it was a disc, and you loaded it up on your computer, and it had with it a church health survey, and you could conduct the survey. You could have somebody to load up the data into that program, and it would automatically generate for you a report. Well, after trying to use that for a while, for a lot of reasons, we chose to move away from that. But we took that church health survey from Ministry Toolbox and tried to condense it down to the most important questions. And then we also took the Lawless survey and some of the TCAT information and thought about the things they were asking and used the best from all of those. And so what we came up with is this green sheet. Now, for those of you that are watching the video, it may not be green unless you chose to print it out on green, but it's the Church Health Assessment Survey. Let me just walk you through that very briefly. First of all, you're going to notice in the background some big words. You see those big words in the background? Worship, prayer, evangelism / outreach, discipleship, fellowship, Sunday school, ministry / missions. When you look at most of those words, what do those words remind you of?
Church.
Yeah, the Acts 2 purposes. You remember in the Acts 2 passage where the first church is being described, we pointed out earlier that there are really 6 church purposes that kind of leap out of that story in the book of Acts, and those again are evangelism, discipleship, ministry, worship, fellowship, and prayer. I'll go back to Rainer. If you're trying to memorize the purposes from Acts 2, Rainer in class years ago when I studied with him at Southern Seminary, he said, always remember every present dead frog must wiggle. Every present dead frog must wiggle. Every E is evangelism, present, P, prayer, frog, F, fellowship, must, M, is ministry, and wiggle, W, is worship. You won't forget that, will you? Every dead present frog must wiggle. Or did he say every present dead frog must wiggle? One of the two. Either one of them works. It's a device to help you memorize those. Anyway, let's reel it back in. Those Acts 2 purposes are reflected in this survey. Now, if you look at question number 5, I left the response line on that for you. And you'll notice you have 5 options from which to choose. The question is, do you spend time in daily private prayer and Bible study? Now, you can say, I almost always do that. I usually do that. Sometimes I do that. I rarely do that, or I never do that. From the world of statistics, do y'all know what that scale is called? That's called a Likert scale. Anytime you have a scale that goes from never or rarely up to always or almost always in the world of statistics, that's a Likert scale. And all that does for you is that it gives you an opportunity to assign numeric values to the way you answer those questions. So if you look at that and you mark never on any of those questions, what type of numeric value does a never get? 0. Because never's nothing, right? It's goose egg. It's nothing. It's 0. And so from rarely up to almost always, moving up the scale, you get a 1 through 4. So rarely is a 1, sometimes is a 2, usually is a 3, and almost always gets the value of a 4. So here's what this survey does for you. Beyond the first 4, which are demographic questions, 5 all the way down to 38 begin with 2 words. What are those 2 words?
Do you?
Do you. So what is this tool going after?
Our personal information.
Personal information, behavior. That's right. Personal information is behavior. So this is nothing but a pure behavior survey. Now, some of them actually are a little perceptive because you're asking things like, do you think your church does certain things enough together, and that becomes perception. But most of these are just pure behavior questions that revolve around the 6 Acts 2 purposes. Now, in this survey, we threw in Sunday school. Why do you think we did that?
Because it's important.
Because it's important. Why is Sunday school important?
That's where you learn.
That's where you learn. I would say to you that all of the purposes of the church converge together in the small group in Sunday school. And if they don't converge together in your small groups, you've got a small group problem. If evangelism, and that's the one, frankly, that a lot of small groups live without. You know, they think about our little group, and I can't let this become a lecture on small groups, but I'm going to say this very quickly. Small groups have the tendency to do what? Close. Yeah. But you know, in a church that is very motivated about healthy growth, you want your small groups to do what? You want them to stay open. That's why, again, this isn't an education class, but I'll say this briefly. That's why the curriculum that you use in small groups needs to be an open type curriculum. One of the things that I always struggle with as a pastor is you'd have those small groups that come to you and say, oh, for our Sunday school, can't we do this Beth Moore study? Or can't we do, you know, Every Man's Battle study or whatever? And they didn't like me very much because, well, I think they did like me. They didn't like me when I gave them this response. Because I would always say, no, you can't do that. Because that's a good discipleship class, and we can make room, and there can be time on the schedule for those types of upper level discipleship classes, those good things. But when you do that in a Sunday school class, what are you saying? You're saying we're a closed group. Because those types of studies are cumulative, and in an open small group like a Sunday school class, you want somebody to step in that day and be able to understand the lesson. Now, there may be things, you know, some of them are Bible book studies, and maybe you're in the book of Romans and you were in chapter 2 last week, and this week you're in chapter 3, and you get all that. But the structure of it is open. Okay, I've said way too much about all that. Here's my thing. We include Sunday school or small groups in this survey because we just feel like if a church is going to grow larger in a healthy way, as it grows larger, it has to grow smaller. It has to grow smaller because people crave friendship. People want community. And, you know, once your church is at a certain level, and those who study these things are kind of all over the board with it, but some even say as small as 100. Once your church reaches 75 to 100, it's beyond one big group. And so it's in the small group that they find their community and live out the purposes of the church. Because the church isn't just worship service, right? The church is not the building, the budget, the program. The church is the people. And so for that reason, we include Sunday school in small group. Here's the neat thing about this is that it is completely free, and it is open to critique. It's open to change. You know, you can read these questions and you think about your context and you say, you know, I like that question, but it could be asked a better way for my church. Fine. We'll change the question because this is our tool and we can do that. We analyze it. We do the data from it. And so it's our tool. We can do whatever. So, again, it's not my purpose in our time to convince you you need to do this. You may need to do it. You may not need to do it. But I'm just saying to you that it is a tool that's available. You can use it. If you look at the back side of that sheet, this is the rankings report. And by the way, when you do this, you'll get all kinds of reports. we're able to analyze each question. And so you'll see where your church ranks in each and every question. And then we pull them together under these headings that you see on the other side. And this is from a real church. Names been removed to protect the guilty. And so you can see there how they ranked and what they scored. In prayer, an 83.3, worship 78. You can go right down the line. So for this particular church, as we began to work with them and help them move beyond where they were, what are the things that jumped out to us? Where did we have to start first?
Sunday school.
Yeah, because it's the weakest, it's the lowest. And so we wanted to attack Sunday school first and worked our way right up the line. And even like you see, they scored relatively well in prayer. Well, there's probably a question or two in prayer that really brought them down. So even though they're scoring well in prayer, we want to target those questions that are problem areas. And so that can become part of the strategy of the church. So that's assessment. This isn't necessarily the best one. It's not the only one. There are many, many others. You get on Google and just type in the word church health assessment. I promise you, you'll be inundated with a lot of different types of assessments, and some of them are very, very expensive. But I've given you 3 that I believe are really good, and we could talk about in your situation which one might be best for you if you need to do assessment. But let me go back to what I said a moment ago. If you're not going to do anything with it, don't do assessment. All right? Everybody understand that? Not going to do anything with it. Don't do assessment. Okay. Any question about assessment before we go on to the next thing? Yes, sir.
To compute your percentages, I presume an always would give 100% if everybody said always.
That's correct. So here's the way you do that. That's a really good question, and I appreciate you asking. He's asking, how do you calculate the percentages? Well, if you surveyed 10 people and everybody answered the very best response, almost always, that's going to give you a score of what? 40. Because there's 4 points for an almost always. 10 times 4 is 40, right? You don't have enough hands and feet to calculate that, but I think I'm good on that one. 10 times 4 is 40. So the percentage for each question is the percentage of the perfect score. Where did they end up in that 40? And so all of those added together and averaged together gives you your category score. Does that make sense? So it's, I tell you that this stuff is not rocket science, but for this simpleton, that's about as good as I can go, all right? But anyway, yeah, that's how it's done. Any other question? Yes,
Alan,
brother.
I don't want to bog you down on this, but
That's fine.
is there any value to the notion that you should be careful of investing too much of your energy and resources into your weakest area? Is there any value to the notion that make sure you're
Yes.
spending a lot of energy where you're really strong and staying strong, enhancing those,
Yes.
even as you try to do the other?
Yes, absolutely. That's a tremendous question and a keen observation. In your strategy, and we're not talking about strategy yet, but in your strategy, if you're doing something really, really well, yes, you need to celebrate that, and you still need to continue to pour in energy to that. So you don't remove energy and you don't remove work away from something that you're doing well just to attack something that you're not doing well. Because then all of a sudden this thing's going to turn upside down and you're going to get out of balance. And we'll talk a little more about that when we get to strategy, but that is really good. And at this point, you need to start thinking about that. You don't tear down what's good to build what's not so good. You want what's good to remain. You strengthen those walls that are there, while at the same time you begin to figure out a way that you can attack some of these weaker areas. Very good. Anything else? All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you find when churches use the assessment that the congregation is willing to answer the questions? Because I can't imagine our church being willing to do that.
To answer your question is absolutely. I have not used any type of assessment with any congregation that needed to do it, and if the pastor was championing it, and he's got this vision team around him that's asking for it too, I've yet to meet the congregation that would not do it. There might be, you might have one or two, and I can tell you this, when I get these back, before I turn them in to our help at the convention office that enters this data and everything, a lot of times I'll just flip through them, just to see. And you will see a few of them, not many, but you'll see a few of them where somebody hasn't taken it seriously and they've just gone down through there and marked almost always, almost always, almost always. And I think, oh my goodness, the Lord Jesus Christ has returned and he's walking among us and we didn't even know it. Because I promise you, I've done this. I've myself completed this survey a number of times, and may I just tell you, I'll be transparent enough in front of you to tell you every time I do this, I'm convicted. I really am. Because I promise you, there are some of these things, I hope that most of these things, I would at least be able to say rarely or sometimes. I would hope so. But even at that, I know that I'm not giving my Lord my best effort, my behavior. Let me say this again. You can talk about perception all day long, but if you don't get under the layer of perception and analyze behaviors, it's not going to do you any good.
Right.
It just won't. So you've got to use some type of tool that'll help you get into behaviors. And again, this is individual. The person's being asked, do you, not does your brother, does your sister? Kind of like the old song, not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, oh Lord. Do you? And so as each person in that congregation is asked these do you questions, then that individual behavior all of a sudden, as you analyze it, becomes corporate behavior. Right? So,
in a setting where there's anonymity, where you don't know who's doing that, gives them more freedom to be honest.
Yeah, this is completely anonymous. In fact, if you use something like this, you tell people up front, do not write your name on it. Now, there are some that do, because, I don't need to get into all that.
Almost always.
There are some that do, and they want to add little notes as they go through this thing, but we'll not talk about all that. By the way, let me say this. That's one of the reasons that the transformational church assessment tool from Lifeway has not done well, at least with a lot of our churches, is that number one, it's web-based, and believe it or not everybody in your church is on the internet yet. And then number two, when you do it, you have to give them your email address, and you have to set up a username and password. And a lot of people do that, and they think, well, this isn't anonymous. Although it is. The username and password are never associated with anything in the report. They have to use the username and password, because if you're doing it online, all of a sudden your electricity goes out. You have to be able to get back to it to re-engage the survey. But maybe it's just us Kentuckians. But a lot of our folks, they say, I'm not going to do that, because if I have to identify who I am to do the survey in the first place, I'm just not real sure that people aren't going to figure me out. So, for what that's worth. Any other quick questions or observations about assessment? All right, very good. We're still working on where are we, and now we want to talk about demographics. I've got several things I want to show you here. Let me just introduce you to why it's important, I believe, to use demographics, because when you're asking the question, where are we, you're not just talking about the congregation, but you're also talking about your broader context. Where are we in this community? It helps you with vision. I mean, you might be a relatively small church, and you all know when I use the term small church, by no means is that pejorative, okay? I don't mean that at all, because I actually believe in one big church. And y'all know what I mean by that. There are some of you that even in the room that may disagree with me, but I do believe in a universal church.
Amen.
You know, because when we get to heaven, it's not going to be this little clique and that little group and the Baptists and on it go. But you know, that grand vision that John sees in the book of Revelation is a vision of what? It's a vision of all nations, all tribes, all tongues, all ethnic groups standing before the throne of God and worshiping the Lamb. So I do believe in the big church. So when I say small church, please know I don't mean that in any negative way whatsoever. But hear me. If you are a relatively small church numerically in somewhat of an isolated community, what good is it going to do in your vision to say in 5 years from now we see ourselves running 1,200 in worship? Yeah, it's not going to help you at all. So demographics, as you're defining where you are, they help you look beyond the four walls of the church. And so from the outset of demographics, it's very much outreach oriented, because it's not just what's happening here with this group of people. So demographics help you understand what's happening in your community. Is your community growing? Is it stagnant? Is it declining? It answers those questions for you. And most people think they already know the answer to that question, but I can tell you, I've done enough of this at this point where I know that most people really don't understand their own community. They don't. And furthermore, in the church, and I'd almost guarantee it in this room, and those of you that are watching the video, wherever you are and with whichever church you associate yourself, I guarantee you that you have, for whatever reason, you have several highly active members that are driving into that church from outside that community. You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. You have that. And so a lot of people are involved in a church and not involved in the local community. Yeah. So they may understand the community where they live 10, 15 miles away, but that community that's right around the church campus, they really may not understand it. So demographics gets you beyond that dilemma. You begin to see really what's happening in that community. You begin to see the diversity in the community. We're becoming more and more diverse, even in rural Kentucky. We just are. We have ages all over the place, genders obviously different, although there are some people that don't know from day to day which gender they are. That's not an amen, that's an oh me statement, by the way. Race is changing. Let me probe you a little bit on that one. How in rural Kentucky communities is race changing? You see Indians coming in, but even more than the Indians, Hispanics. I can tell you this without exception. Now, there's, I'm sure, an exception out there, but I've yet to help a church with demographics. But what we didn't discover, the Hispanic community right there around them has grown in the last decade. I'm talking about places out in nowhere. You know, you may say, I go to First Baptist of Podunk, Kentucky. I've yet to do demographics that did not reflect changing Hispanic population. And of course, you know, we can get into all kinds of political things, and we're not going to, but I will say this, and I want everybody to hear me. Whether or not that person is there legally, they need Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And yes, sir.
In talking about, I mean, every analysis of demographics I've seen in my day job, and one of the things that I
Sure you have.
analyzed was something called the homestead exemption, based on age. And one thing that's abundantly clear to me, any model you look at, is we are getting old. You know, they're in a very short while, there are going to be a lot more old people than there are young people.
Yes.
And so, I mean, and that's something that we really aren't
That's right.
fighting for at all.
Yeah, that's right.
And your churches are probably that way too.
Yes. I believe in a multi-generational church. Can I get on a soapbox for 2 minutes?
Yes.
My class, I'll do what I want to. You know, we've talked a little bit. We've touched on church planting a little bit. I'm a proponent of it. I love it. We need more of it. I like it. I love it. I want more of it. All right. We need to see more plants. But I tell you, one of the things that a lot of hot blowing and going churches is going to have to start thinking about is, you know, right now they've strategized to reach the 20-somethings or early 30-somethings with the little babies and the little children. And guess what? If they're going to be a vibrant church 20 years from now, the 30-somethings are going to be the 50-somethings. And the 40-somethings are going to be the 60-somethings. And so just understand this, at some point, they have to discover how they're going to be multi-generational. Now, a lot of established churches are on the opposite end of that. You know, they have a kind of a graying effect going on in the church, and they're trying to figure out, you know, how they position themselves to reach some younger people. Well, just know that over time, all that has a way of leveling out. All right? So, you know, if you ever develop strategy, and this leads right into what you were saying, if you develop strategy that just isolates a demographic, it's a poor strategy. I remember, you know, studying church growth back in the 90s, and that was kind of the big rave at that time. You know, you choose the demographic that you're going to focus on, that you're going to go after. The big word is homogeneous. You know, the homogeneous unit principle, where people that are close to being alike kind of come together and congregate together. And churches use that ad nauseum, in my opinion, at one point. But I'm just saying that a lot of churches that were planted and I won't call any names, but even in this community where in this very community, we have churches that came along and developed in the 90s, and they used that, and now they're really declining because at some point along the journey, they forgot that those 30-year-olds in the 90s, 30 years later, are what?
60s.
Well, it's kind of like we really want you now, but 12 years from now, we don't want you, we want you.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So what are they doing? Leaving church or migrating to other churches that are more their age group?
More than anything, they leave.
Just leave.
They just leave and flounder. All right. So they help you see the diversity in your community, and you want to see that diversity. And when you think about strategy, I'm of the opinion that you don't leave anybody out. Now, there's probably a generation or two that you want to focus on because you're not doing what you need to do to reach that generation. But in focusing on them, you've got to work with the others that you have too, because ultimately, you're going to be a multi-generational church if you're viable and healthy 2 decades from now. You have to be. They help you understand if people in your community are financially sound or struggling. Listen, you can find a lot of things out with demographics. They help you communicate effectively. You know, you begin to learn the people in your community. Where do they go for information? Where are they learning about you? And they help you do that. And then obviously they help you craft your outreach efforts more effectively. This just goes back to being fishers of men, right? You know, Jesus called us to fish for men. If you fish, you got to figure out the kind of bait that you've got to use. And we won't go back into that conversation. But again, that's where you have to think about methodology. Message stays the same. Methodology must change if you're going to reach the people in your community. So those are the things that demographics do for you. Now, I want to show you what this looks like in brief. I can't get into all of it, but I want to show you a real case study of a church that I've recently helped. And by the way, they've given me full permission because this really doesn't analyze much about them, but just their community. This church I've recently helped start to understand the community around us. Some of you may recognize that picture. It's an artist's rendition of downtown London, Kentucky. And First Baptist Church in London is getting really, really serious about crafting outreach efforts and understanding their community and who is in that community. So recently at a weekend retreat for their leadership, I analyzed their demographics, and I'm going to show you just some of the highlights that came out of that. And I show you this only to say what they discovered, your church can discover too. And for those of you that are serving Kentucky Baptist churches, what I'm about to show you, if you want something like this done for your church, it's one phone call away from you. All you have to do is ask. It's available to you. We do it, and we furthermore love to do it. So let me show you what this looked like for First Baptist London. First of all, before we go into demographics, let me talk to you very briefly about the Glen Mary report. This is important, and this works for wherever you are. You can get data from the Glen Mary report if you're in Alaska or Hawaii or wherever, because it's a nationwide piece of research. It's the most complete data available on U.S. religious affiliation. By the way, the Glen Mary group is not even evangelical. They're a Catholic religious research organization, and they do their research every decade. So the most recent is 2010, so it's getting somewhat dated, but we won't have new information from Glen Mary until deep into 2020. So they do it every decade, and here's what it does. The Glen Mary research measures adherence, affiliation, and attendance. Now, what do those things mean? Well, each one means a little something different. Adherence is just basically, is there a faith system? Is there a denomination, a religious group that you basically adhere to? It's kind of like reading an obituary, and someone has passed away, and down at the end of that obituary, it'll say he or she was of the Methodist faith. Well, what does that mean? That means that somebody in the family said, well, they kind of inclined themselves toward that particular group. That's adherence. Affiliation is the next step, and it's when you actually join a group. So you're actually a member of that group. And then the third thing is attendance. You actually go to that group. So it moves from agreeing with the group to being a member of the group to actually showing up and going when that group assembles, when they come together. Of those three things, which of those do you think is most important?
Attendance.
No doubt about it. The most important thing is attendance. We all know that we have church members, let alone those who roughly adhere. We all have church members that the CIA and the FBI combined together can't find. I just believe this, and y'all may not like to work with numbers, and I understand you can get overzealous about numbers and focus on them too much, maybe. There's probably a time that I did, be honest with you. People in my church started calling me Count Allen because I always wanted the counts, what do we have here, what do we have there. I've mitigated that some over the years, but I'm just going to tell you it's still important. It's just important, folks. We can make ourselves feel better to talk about it like it's not and diminish it, but at the end of the day, I want to know how many people we're affecting. And the only way you can know that is by counting the noses, right? That's the only way you know it. My dad, and I suppose others around his age group, would say this a great deal. He would say, we count people because people count.
Yeah.
That's right.
He still says it.
That's right. We count people because people count. So, in the Glen Mary report, I think the most important section that you look at is attendance. That's what I want to know. Who in that community is going to church? And looking at the Glen Mary statistics, for those of you that have the paper copy, it's the blue copy. What I've given you here is from the 2010 Glen Mary work, and that's all 120 counties in Kentucky. On the front side, you'll notice that those are ranked. So from the county that has the least attendance statistic all the way up to the county that has the greatest attendance statistic. So when we're talking about attendance here, please understand this. This is all faith groups. This isn't Baptist, it isn't Methodists, it isn't Presbyterians, charismatic or automatics. It's not. It's all faith groups. And in those faith groups could be cults. All right? So this is gauging cults. It's gauging it's gauging all the different people that are out there and their participation in those faith groups. So you'll see it ranked on the front side. If you flip that over, you'll see it in alphabetical order. So whatever county you come from, you can find it alphabetized there, and you can, here's what's handy about this. For instance, those of you that are in the room right now, we're in Pulaski County. So Pulaski County is nearly 18% in church attendance. So if you flip that back over, then that makes it handy. You can find how Pulaski County ranks out. And so you can see just by this chart that Pulaski County, Kentucky is in the upper third in regard to attendance, but only about 18%. So what is that telling us? 18% of the people in this county on a given week is attending worship somewhere. So you can talk about membership, you can talk about all kinds of other things, but when I gauge it, I want to talk about attendance, because here's what I believe. And I do believe this. I believe it's a sin to not go to church. Why do I say that? Because the Bible tells me so. The book of Hebrews tells us to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. How many of you agree with me? To not do what the Bible tells us to do is sin.
Amen.
Now I'm going to take it one step further. And you may agree or disagree with me, but I'm going to tell you this. Someone who habitually sins, in other words, there's a besetting sin in his or her life, and they live years and years and years and years and years and years with that sin being prevalent and prominent in their lives, I cannot trust that person's salvation. Because the Apostle John tells us in 1 John that we don't do that. We don't continue to live a lifestyle of sin. So somebody that says he or she is a Christian and stays out of church, there's one or two things going on. Either number one, he or she is not saved. Or number two, he or she is so pathetically backslidden that they're to a place where they're up against an accounting with the Lord, and they might be sinning unto death.
So, Brother Allen, can I ask the next obvious question?
Yeah.
All right, at least obvious in my mind. So where do you categorize that 75% of those who do attend your church, but only on Sunday morning? You don't see them on Sunday night or Wednesday night. Where do you put them?
Boy, that's a good question.
I mean, if it's a sin,
Yeah.
if it's a sin not to go to church, it's a sin to miss church on Sunday night habitually. It's a sin to miss church on Wednesday night. I mean, that is forsaking the assembling ourselves together.
It is.
Where do you categorize it?
I am, and I'm not afraid of your question, but I'd rather have this. I mean, that is a long. If I get into that, we're going to be talking about that for the next 30 minutes.
Okay.
So will you give me that privilege to you and I can talk about that?
That'd be good.
I do have an opinion about that, and I'll be glad to give it to whomever. But I'm not going to be able to finish this if I probe that right now. But that's a fine question. You know, that's
because
a fine
we all
question.
have Easter lilies and Christmas presents.
Oh, well, sure.
And, so we have some that are a step above that are come in late on Sunday morning, and that's the only time you see them.
Mm-hmm.
They're in attendance, but they're not engaged.
Yeah. I'd be glad to talk to you about that. But let's move forward. And I have no problem with the question. But that's a 30, that could be a 3-hour conversation. All right, so for the purpose of analyzing demographics, we're going to use the attendance statistics. I think I've made my case for why you should, right?
Yes.
All right, so here's what I want you to see. Back to the blue sheet actually. For Laurel County, again, this is work I did for First Baptist London. For Laurel County, they've got 43.6 adherents, 34.5 affiliates, and then only 13.5% of Laurel Countyans attend church. So just remember those stats from the Glen Mary report, and you'll see how we use those in demographics in just a moment. So, for London First Baptist, here's what we did. We did a 1-3-5 mile, which is pretty standard when you analyze demographics for a congregation. We did a 1-3-5 mile study. So these are concentric circles with the church facility being right there in the center. So the bullseye is a 1 mile ring out from the church being in the center, the facility being in the center, and then the 3 mile ring, and then the larger ring is the 5 mile. So here's what we found out for them. In their 1 mile ring, they had 3,843 people. In their 3 mile ring, they had 16,033 people. In their 5 mile ring, they had 27,518 people within a 5 mile drive of their facilities. Here are their trends. You see the current across the top. You see where they were in 2010, and then you see where they are in 2020, or where they're projected to be rather in 2022. All right, those come just from the study of demographics. And so here's the point. London's a growing community. Somerset's a growing community. There are a few other growing communities in our region, but those two particularly very much are growing communities. So here's what we did. Applying this Glen Mary research to their population. If only 13.5% of Laurel Countyans attend church on a given Sunday within 1 mile of the First Baptist Church in London, Kentucky, there are 3,324 people not in church. In 3 miles, there are 13,869 not in church. In 5 miles, there are 23,802 people that are not in church. Now, before you listen to this and you just kind of excuse all this and say, well, we're not in a growing community. Here's what I will guarantee you. Even if your 1, 3, and 5 mile rings are not growing, I can promise you this. There's a lot more people out of church in those rings than there are in church. Now, these are some pretty large statistics, but I'm telling you, wherever you are, within that 5 mile ring, you take all the evangelical churches in that ring. If everybody who's not in church next Sunday decided they were going to go to church, you couldn't seat them. So Jesus was right, wasn't he?
Yeah.
What he said of his day is very true of our day. The field is white, and it's ready to be harvested. Where are the workers? By the way, a sermon, not even a lesson, but a sermon for another day. Jesus said, where are the workers? And then what did he say? Pray to the Lord of the harvest that he might do what? Maybe sometimes rather than complaining about our laborers, we ought to pray for more. Amen. You have not because you ask not. And so make that a serious prayer within your church. Lord God, you told us to pray for laborers. Lord, send the laborers. And by the way, it's okay to pray for them by name. You know, you look over your congregation. This bears into your question a little bit. You know, in any congregation, you have a core, a committed, and a crowd. You know that? Your core, the people that's always there, people you can count on. The committed, those that are usually there and you usually can count on. And then you got a crowd of people that, you know, just are there if they feel like it. observers. It's all right to look out in that crowd and see somebody and say, man, I see what he does for Little League. I see what she does in the PTA. Boy, if they just do a little bit of that in the church, we could use that kind of energy. We could use that kind of person. And it's all right to call that person's name out to the Lord, isn't it?
Yes.
Now you have to be discreet around who you call that name out to. You get that. I'm not telling you to be a bull in a china shop. But it's all right to pray with insight and say, man, Lord, I see Sam there, and he's a great Little League coach, and he's wonderful with those kids, but just doesn't do much here in the church. God, convict him. And God, show me what I need to do personally with him that I might draw him in to being a worker. How do I get off on all these things? So when you compare Glen Mary, or apply rather Glen Mary to their populations, that's what you come up with. And then working with demographics, as far as age groups, here's what we found when we analyzed First Baptist London. 24.5% were 19 years old or younger. 32% were 20 to 44 years old. The midlifers, which is 45 to 65% or ages, make up 26.5% of their population. 17% senior adults, 60 or over. Currently, 562 Hispanics. That's up from, you remember what I told you earlier? Up from 401 in 2010. Hispanic population for that 5-mile ring around the center of London, Kentucky, is projected to grow to 661 by 2022. They're here and they're going to continue to come. And the question is, who's reaching them? Now, I know that we've had some Hispanic congregations and we've done some ethnic church planting and that kind of thing, but we need to open our doors to them. We need to help them assimilate into our culture. Now, if we do that by offering a lot of different things, such as English as second language, all that's good. But it ought to be done with the goal of making them an assimilated part of who we are. They shouldn't be isolated. They should be a part of the bigger whole. So as we analyze this, I mean, look what we saw that this really stuck out like the proverbial sore thumb. Now, when we go back, give a word of caution. This is by no means to say that you ignore and don't strategize for all of the others. But for that particular church, 56.5% of their reachable population in that 5-mile ring are young families with children at home. That's what the demographics tell us, right? You see it? 24.5, 19 or under, 32%, 20 to 44. That's duh, right? That's just duh stuff. So what do they have to do? They better figure out how they continue to be a multi-generational church, but put some energy down where the bulk of the population. That's right. Over half of their population are young people with children at home. So they've got to think about them. The way, and I'm going to use a term here that some don't like, but the way they market their church, the way they advertise their church, the messages they put out, they better focus on this group. So,
It's available to any church that will request it.
absolutely. You call me, those of you that are in this region, you call me, I'll bring it to you. We'll sit down and talk about it. I'll put a report, I'll analyze it. And this is just scratching the surface. You know, we could talk about just their demographics for the next hour and a half. So you call us, we'll be glad to bring it. So do you see how demographics are so very important if you're talking about where you are, your current reality? All right. Let's talk.
Alan?
Yes.
Is there a latest updated idea or statistic on how far people are willing to drive to come to your church?
I think I don't know of a good, solid piece that's based on legitimate research. Most of what I hear about is very anecdotal, just observational. But by observation, I think people are seeing all the time that if people are interested in coming to church, they'll drive out of the county.
20 or 25 miles doesn't matter.
Yeah, they will. Yeah. I mean, I can give you all kinds of names of people that I know personally that are driving great distances because they found a place where they fit and that is ministering to their needs. Let's talk about vital statistics. And of course, in Baptist life, particularly Southern Baptist life, this comes from your ACPs. It tracks changes in your membership, gives you your baptisms and additions, your growth. I'll give you a couple little sub-points here. 12 conversions or baptisms per year for every 100 in attendance is considered healthy. It tracks your worship and your small group attendance. Healthy churches have one small group for every 10 in worship attendance. The goal of a healthy congregation ought to be an average of at least 70% of worship attenders in small groups. If it's worse than that, you're out of balance. Listen, you can never assimilate people. When I use that term assimilate, does everybody understand what I mean by that? It's just a term that means taking something from the outside and putting it in to the inside of something. You ladies, when you bake a cake, you assimilate things. The egg, the oil, the flour, the sugar. You know, when you bring one ingredient and you put it in, you make up a batter and it's all assimilated. That's what it means. You're taking something from the outside, you're putting it in the inside. And you cannot assimilate people and think that they're going to stick if it's all just about worship. You've heard the old saying, you can grow a mile wide and an inch deep. That's what worship assimilation by itself does for you. Now, worship is the front door. People are going to come to worship before they come to small groups primarily. So you can't excuse your thoughts about worship and how you do worship, etc. But I'm just telling you, it's important to start those small groups in your church.
Well, Alan,
Yes, sir.
if you see an increase in the number of attendance in your small groups, is that going to correlate with the increase in attendance in the worship?
Typically, but not always. I have known a few churches that were so serious about small group and Sunday school that they're out of balance the other way. I've seen churches that actually, not much anymore, but now years ago, when we really were more serious than we are these days about Sunday school, I've known a lot of churches that ran more in Sunday school than they did in worship.
Because they worked harder at it.
They worked harder at it. That's exactly right. So that's a very rare exception now. And so vital statistics also help you track missions, participation, and church finances. Go back to your paperwork here and look at this ivory. This is a real case study that I did a couple years ago for a real church. Remove the name here because this particular church, you remember what I told you one of our earlier sessions, that it's one thing to talk about numbers, but when you graph it out, when you see what's happening in a linear graph, it really helps you process what's going on with your numbers. You know, it's one thing to talk about, well, 10 years ago we were running 20 more than we are now and that kind of thing. But when you look at something like this on paper, you know, what's the old saying? A picture's worth what? 1,000 words. So here's a church that, you know, kind of declined and then a shot back up and then a fairly significant linear decline in the last few years. And see, look at that. You say 218 to 197. Well, that doesn't sound like much, but when you see it on paper,
It's going down.
there's a pretty bad trajectory going on here. All right. And then in that next chart, you see their total additions. And by the way, I'm giving you a very quick snapshot. Again, you can look at Sunday school, you can look at baptisms, you can break baptisms down within the age groups, all of those things. But for this purpose, I'm just showing you total additions. Total additions are baptisms and letters, people that are coming into your church by transfer. So you see all that. On the back side, you'll see a graph of their finances. But when you pull those pieces of the puzzle together, they begin to tell a story. And what does the story tell us? Well, membership. I didn't give you a graph on their membership, but their total membership had really, really grown, while their worship average had declined by almost negative 11%. And one of the things I do when I do this is I calculate what their annual growth rate is. I don't have time to explain that to you, but over a period of time, you can calculate what's happening year by year by year. And so as you do that, with this particular church, their annualized growth rate at that point was almost a negative 2%. And if that continues, 10 years from now, they're going to be down to 163. And then you noticed, as you looked on the front page, you really see a trend over the last 4 years at the time that I did this study. So because that stood out to me, I wanted to see what's the growth rate for those years. And so it's worse than the 1.85%. It's actually 3.31. And so if that trend continues, then in 10 years, they're going to diminish down to 141. They're baptizing well. They're having a lot of additions. So they're reaching people. So what's the problem here? Say it out loud. There's an assimilation problem. They're reaching people. They're baptizing people. People are coming into the church, but they're not sticking. They're not assimilating. Assimilation, a good statistic is, this is a Lifeway statistic, you ought to be able to keep 7 out of 10. You know the parable of the soils, right? Sometimes the soil's going to end up in a place where there's a quick flash and then it's gone. Sometimes the soil's going to take root. So 7 out of 10. So if they would have assimilated just 7 out of 10 of the people they reached, they would have increased their attendance by 167. So at the point of this study, they would have been running 387 in worship. So they've got to answer some questions. Yes, sir.
That 2016 is stunning, with 65 additions, and you go down in worship.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there's, you know, I will not reveal this situation, but there are some logistical reasons for that.
A lot of bus kids?
No, it was not really. Some have more to do with facilities. So, what are the questions they've got to continue to think through? What are they doing to train new members? Sometimes new members don't stick because they don't really understand your expectations of them. What's the strategy for assimilating people into their Sunday school small group? Are you helping people discover their gifts and giving them a job to do? You know, one of the ways you help people stick in your church is you make them responsible for something. And sometimes it might sound silly. You know, sometimes you have to come up with something. But I tell you, it won't sound silly to the person you ask to do it.
What if they're not willing to accept doing something?
Well, you can't do anything about that. You can't do anything about it. But I'm telling you, most of the people, we don't ask them to do anything. So it's not that we really need to, and I value your question. And there will be those that just say, "No, this is not for me. I just want to come."
I help, but I won't teach.
Yes, sir.
How do you break the trend of more established members, I'll use that phrasing, in the church from taking you to the woodshed when you try to apply someone that's new into a position? Because I have run into that recently.
You pray for them.
That's what I did.
You pray for them, and then sometimes, you remember what we talked about back when we discussed change? When you change things, not everybody's going to like it. And if they don't like it, sorry. If you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, please understand me. You're not a bull in a china shop, and you've got to, sometimes these things get very delicate, and you have to know how to work with that. But listen, at the end of the day, you do the right thing. Just do the right thing. And if you lose that person that's disgruntled, you know, you're going to make that up with the people that you're giving work to do. We're
I always
over
thought it
time.
was better to be criticized because you're doing something than criticized because you're not doing nothing.
Amen.
Doing nothing.
Amen. Yeah, if you're going to be criticized, make it be because you're trying to get somewhere, not because you're sloughing, not doing anything. When you analyze giving, I just wanted to give you this statistic. Lifeway gives it to us. Every person in attendance, an average attendance, including children and preschoolers, ought to reflect about $26 a week in the budget. Now, if you're in a very poor area, if you're in a place that's in an economic decline, that may be an exception, and you get that. But all things being normal, you ought to be bringing in about $26 a week per person in average attendance. All right, very quickly, we're about out of time. Building and grounds, what are we looking for? We're looking for barriers, right? Parking spaces. You need to have one parking space for every 2 people in attendance. Seating, we've talked about that some already, but 27 inches. Number was 20 inches at one time. You can deduce what you want to from that. Maximum capacity of facility, 80%. Some are saying 70% now, but somewhere in that area, you know, people won't come to church. Now they'll go to Rupp Arena and Neyland Stadium and other places. Boy, why did I have to mention Tennessee? I love you, Tennessee guys. By the way, I love you very, very much. Love you, brother. But you know, that's right. That's right. You get that people will crowd into a stadium, but they're not going to crowd into your worship center.
Alan, that means if you built a building 25 years ago to seat 600, it seats about 400.
That's
now.
exactly right. That's just exactly right. And some of you saying, well, that's not our problem. We got all kinds of space. We just need to put people in the space. But I'm telling you this, problems are problems. Now, I'd rather have a good problem like this than a bad problem.
Yes.
You know, there are good problems and bad problems, right? But even good problems are problems, and you got to figure them out. I got to move on. I want to say more about that, but I won't. Dated facilities. Now look, I don't mean to pick on anybody, but so many of our facilities, they just look worn out. They're outdated, out of style. They look dank. Some of them do. Anyway. Unkempt exterior, uncut grass, untrimmed landscaping, dilapidated playground. What does it say to a newcomer if they pull up to your building and there's weeds all in your flower bed? You'd be better off not to have flower beds than weedy flower beds, right?
Yes.
You'd be better off not to have a playground. This one for sure. You'd be better off not to have a playground than to have one that looks worn out and unsafe. Because what's that saying to young families? That church really doesn't care about my children. Foul odor. Some churches stink, literally. Absence of clear signage. I could go on all day about it, but I can't. But a guest, you need to have signage where a guest can navigate your building. If you don't have that kind of signage, you're going to have to overcome that with people. You're going to have escorts and people to show them around. And answer me this. Which one is easier? You need people for everything, right? You need people to be greeting. You need people to be teaching. You need people to be singing. You need people to be doing this and that. You can overcome a lot of things with good, logical, clear signage. And with that signage comes a number system where you number all the small group doors and you're able to communicate that. A cluttered interior. You walk in and everything's disheveled and it gives an impression that the whole ministry is unorganized. Dirty restrooms. Everybody has to go, right?
Yes.
Make it as pleasant as possible, especially for the ladies. Amen, girls? All kinds of uncomfortable factors. Seating could be uncomfortable. Smell needs to be as neutral as possible. You remember I said a moment ago that some churches literally stink? But some churches overdo the aerosol. There's one particular church that I work with quite often, and man, when you step into their greeting area, you're just overwhelmed with this sweet smell. And I don't know about, almost. And I don't know about anybody else, but I'm very sensitive to smell. I'm very sensitive to smell. And it's hard for me to work in their environment because they just overdo it. So the best policy in regard to smell is to make it as neutral as possible. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Don't overdo the plug-in things and the things that automatically spray and all that kind of thing. Youth children facilities, two big factors, safety and sanitation. Preschool and young children areas are of utmost importance, right?
Yes.
If they're not safe, and boy, that gets into another conversation for another class. But safety means a lot of things these days, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And so they've got to be safe. They've got to be clean. Now let me talk to you as we wrap up this session about how a secret shopper can help you. The goal is to use somebody that's absolutely unbiased and absolutely a third party so that person can attend a typical primary worship experience at a given church. It's good to do Sunday school or small groups as well so that they can give you a true, honest perspective of what a first-time guest feels like when they come to your campus. They need to have no prior history with the church, and so they're answering that question. There are all kinds of secret shopper inventories that you can get, and I would do this if I didn't do anything else I've talked to you about today. If I were the pastor of a church, this is one I would do. I would find me somebody, friend from another town or whatever. I would find somebody to come in and give me an unbiased, honest opinion of what it feels like when you come there for the first time. I have a few people trained in the region. Now, if everybody reaches out to me and wants it all of a sudden, then it's going to take a long time to get it scheduled because I have a family in a couple of different counties that they see this as a ministry. And so they've done this for me and a variety of places, and I probably could tap into them to do it for your church. But they're really good, and they give me back really good feedback. And so there are all kinds of inventories you can tap into to have somebody do it for you. But I want to give you this very quickly before we dismiss from this session. Greg Atkinson is a really good nationwide church consultant, and he's done a lot of work with secret shoppers or secret guests, and he has written a book that's entitled Secrets of a Secret Shopper. And he deals with things, and as he does secret guest work, they're very comprehensive. It's not about just arriving, but they're looking at website and mobile site and all those things for the first time. And so here's some takeaways from his book. 4 points of impression before the guests ever enter the church's building: social media, mobile site, website, and parking lot. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You might say, well, Alan, we're a rural country church. Let me tell you something. You need good internet presence. Good. If you can't have good internet presence, you're better out without it.
Amen.
Better off without it. You know, if you have one of these old looking websites, and here's the thing, most people, particularly median adults down to young adults, the first place they look for your church is really not on their computer, but it's on their phone. And a mobile presence. You know, you have a website that's designed for a bigger screen, but if it doesn't communicate well on the mobile, then you've got a little problem there. So just keep those things in mind. Most people, and particularly younger people ask me that all the time, again, because I primarily work with established churches, and established churches, by and large, are having trouble reaching younger people. And people say, well, we have a website. Then I say, have you had a 30-something-year-old to talk to you about your website? Have you had somebody look at how that website communicates on the mobile device? Folks, we're not in Kansas anymore. We're not. And it's important that you think through these things. And I know, listen, I have loaded y'all up with all kinds of things, and it's like drinking water from a fire hydrant, and you can't do it all overnight. But this is one of those things you've got to start thinking about. Because the younger people are going to look, if they're going to look for a church, the first place they're going to do it is probably on their phone. You know, time flies, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And it seems like it was just yesterday we were talking about you've got to get on the internet. That's 20 years ago. Now we're talking about mobile devices. That's just how things change.
Well,
And
I can say, a few years ago, we had the Share Jesus Up Here workshop for
Yes.
the association. And when we started talking about how to communicate with people, everyone in the room under 40, about the first suggestion out of their mouth was Facebook or Twitter.
yeah,
And those of us that were over 40 use, other means.
right.
But everyone there under the age of 40 said the same thing. Try selling your house
Yeah, without
when you start talking about, in my day job, I'm seeing that
absolutely,
more.
absolutely
If you don't have
right.
the internet, someone under 40 is going to say, "Oh, we're going somewhere else."
You're absolutely
It's
right.
starting to affect the market.
Look at number 2. Parking is not only a first impression issue; it's a potential growth lid. You know, if guests come onto your property and they don't find a parking spot easily, they may say, well, we're just not going to come back. Children area is a critical growth lid. We talked about that a moment ago. 80% rural still applies. Greeters gathered together talking to one another may be less effective than no greeters at all.
Amen.
You get that, don't you?
Yep.
You know, they're in a holy huddle, and surprise, a visitor walks up, guest comes for the first time, and they're too busy and too engaged in their conversation to help the guest. And that sends a signal, I promise you, that'd be much worse than not having any greeter at all. So is it important to figure out where you are?
Yeah.
You'll never figure out where you need to go until you answer the first big question, where are we? All right, God bless you. Thank you for your attendance and attention, and we'll catch you next time.